thank you for coming. It appears that we are in the midst of a mini disaster, especially for IT type folks. All of a sudden, you're having to test out the plans that you probably had in place, and apparently 58% of you have updated your plan this year, which is fantastic. But it's a good test of it. And during some of the chat before the webinar started, interesting how that one of the issues people run into is that, for instance, the VPN, they don't have enough licenses. And that's probably something that a lot of people didn't think about. They probably thought about that we have VPN, we have a couple critical people that might need to use it, but we didn't think about the whole department or the whole company needed to use VPN in order to connect from home. Bandwidth is going to be another issue too. I've noticed some slight slowing on some things, and it just makes me wonder that a lot of people are using that network traffic. We've all gotten kind of addicted to having this really fast internet, and now all of a sudden it's finally being used for work. It was used for work before, but now there's a whole lot of probably non-essential things going on. Anyway, so it's a bit of a tough time, and everyone just needs to hold steady. One of the things I wanted to comment on, just that if you're doing a lot of time from home, I personally, I don't like, I wear headsets, but I don't really care for headsets. I know they work pretty well. One of the things I wanted to point out is just from an ergonomics point of view is that one of my friends suggested that I go ahead and get a standalone microphone and use my computer speakers. And that has worked out really well for me. I am using something, let's see if I can get here in the camera, I'm using a blue snowball, and it was about 60 bucks, and it comes with a little stand, and you just plug it into a USB port, and that works really well. And then I have a pair of $20 speakers. I've got my webcam, and I'm set here. So if you're going to be spending a lot of time online, doing a lot of work from home type stuff and doing a lot of online meetings, maybe you don't want to have to wear a headset. So for not very much money, you can look at being set up here and make yourself a lot more comfortable. But let's talk about high availability and disaster recovery. Who am I? As you know, if you've been coming to my webinars, and thank you very much for coming to all of them, and I think the next one's going to be a lot of fun too. I am a, let's see if we can get this out of the way. I'll move this, my little picture here. There, maybe that'll work. I am a senior database administrator, and I've worked for years in lots of different environments and different platforms. I've supported Windows, I've supported Unix, I've supported VMS, Baxes for all those people might remember those, and currently I spend a lot of time working on Azure, which is really just another OS platform. Supported Oracle, SQL Server, Ingress, Pervasive, a number of different database platforms. I am a local SQL Server user group leader. I'm also trying to be a regional supporter as much as I can afford and make time for. I go to SQL Saturdays. One of the things I put down here is look at SQLSaturday.com. That's one of the reasons why the first poll question was about if you're a member of PASS or not. Especially in this time when maybe you're feeling a little bit distanced from your teammates because you're working at home, I think it's important to get out there on the web, get on the internet, and start talking to other people who are in the industry. I will say again and again that being a member of PASS has really made my life much better. It's just wonderful going to SQL Saturdays. I always feel happier after I'm done. Going there and seeing a lot of other people who presenting on topics. It's a lot of fun both to listen to people do topics as well as presenting yourself. And that leads into going in the community. There is probably some sort of data or SQL Server user group or Oracle group, depending on whatever you'd like to support, around. And I guarantee you that those group leaders would be happy to have anyone who might want to show up and talk about some topic for 5, 10, 15, 50, 60 minutes. Reach out to them, let them know what your topic is. And not only that, but you'll be able to find some help with making your presentation for the first time or refining your presentation. I just think that you're going to find that even though it's a little bit scary talking in front of other people, it's a lot of fun. Now in this current climate, you may be doing it on the webinar, which is, it's also its own challenges, but the point is that you can do this as well. And then finally, I put the link for pass.org on there. Go to Pass and sign up, it's free. You'll be a member of a gigantic organization. You'll have access to a lot of white papers. There's a lot of free webinars that are going on at all times, because PASS has a lot of virtual groups. Even before all this happened, there were virtual groups. And for instance, I personally belong to the professional development one and the performance groups. And so I get emails from those group leaders telling me about when the next virtual session is going to be. But let's talk about HA. HA is not DR, DR is not HA. They are different, even though I think that the two terms are oftentimes confused, and that's not, there's a reason for that, because they are very similar, they're very close, and the dividing line is very fine between the two of them. But the point is, as I've stressed in most of my webinars, is that you as a data professional are there to provide continuity for the business. And that's your job. Whether it be, we talked about backup and recovery, we talked about lift and shift, we talked about security in the previous webinars, but the point is that all of those are there to make the business run. Continuity. And as a data professional, you are in a unique position where you should understand the infrastructure as well as understand the business. And if you don't, well, get out there and understand it. High availability, really the term is highly available, because it's there to keep the data and the applications for the business, your users. As all flows back to IT maintaining business continuity. You are not alone, you have a team. Work with your team. But more importantly, for your team to work with that business and to really understand what systems really need to be running. Triage, which was the term that was developed in order to triage wounded troops, is also used in the IT community about triaging the systems. And it could be that there are systems that are very popular. Maybe your users think that they're needed, but in truth, it could be that there's actually a very simple system that is dead critical to the business for running. And that's why it's important to get out there and work with the business. We're going to stress that point once again about the planning, the talking, the documenting, the reviewing, working with all levels of the business. And this is an opportunity. In this case, it's not just going to be working with the application users. You're also going to be working with the HR team. You're going to be working with the executives. A DR plan is not something that should be made lightly, and you need to be aware of the impact and what you can do. Because another point I want to stress during this presentation is that it's not all your responsibility. I firmly believe that IT's responsibility and the DBA's responsibility is to start the conversation with the business. But it's not your responsibility to fix it. Once you've had the conversation, you can only go do as much as you can. The business has to understand what the limitations are. So that is your responsibility. You have to start the conversation. You have to encourage them to talk about the systems, and you have to make sure that the business is aware of the possibilities, of the limitations, of the costs. And then you all work together and come up with a plan that's agreed upon by all levels of the business. There's a lot of ways to provide HA. We're going to talk about hardware, software, and data. Hardware, maybe not as big an issue as it used to be, but back in the day, nowadays, most of the systems have, over the past 20 years, servers have been improving gradually. So most of them usually do have dual power supplies that are hot swappable. Network cards, I remember when they started putting dual ports on each network card, and then you can have dual NICs. So once again, you're removing that single point of failure in your system. Error checking RAM. Again, that's the purpose of that, is to keep the system going. Your storage layer, that's where things get a little bit more complicated. So when you're thinking about the storage layer, let's go back a couple steps. So first of all, what is the core thing that makes the system run? The OS disk. Oftentimes people spend a lot of time and effort worrying about keeping the data available, But in truth, what you need to remember that your OS disk also has to be redundant, because if the OS goes down, well, the system goes down, no matter how good your data might be. And potentially when that system goes down, you could have corruption in your data. So think about the simple little OS disk. Ideally, when you have your local storage, you have some sort of a RAID set up on your system, make sure that you include that OS disk there as well. But if you have for your local attached storage, that's where you do want to put in your RAID arrays for whether it be your data and all the other important parts. There's a number of different RAID levels. We're not going to get into it, but probably the most common you're going to see would be either RAID 5 or RAID 10. Both of those are going to protect your disks through either by parity or through mirroring, and that's going to keep everything going. But even if the server's power supply keeps on going, then you have to think about what about the actual main power that goes to those servers? Do you have a UPS in place? And UPSs only last for so long. Even the best UPSs can't last more than probably about 4 to 6 hours. Because of that, then you have to think about generators, because generators are going to give you an additional probably 3 to 30 days. And you can always have more fuel delivered for them. So these are all things that, as a data professional, you maybe don't have to worry about the nitty-gritty of it. But again, I'm going to stress that it's important for a DBA to understand what the infrastructure is, what are the capabilities, and what are the requirements. Because if you don't have a server, how's your data going to work? Finally, if you have your data center, if you don't have everything local on your site, you're probably using an offsite data center, whether that be Azure or some other company locally or distant. The point is that how are you connecting to that data center? All of a sudden, your network just became your biggest bottleneck and your biggest risk, because if you can't connect to the data center, well, then you can't get to your data. So these are all decisions, whether you have a dedicated second network line, whether you have an agreement with your telco provider to make sure that you always have, you check the SLA to make sure that it's available. There's just a lot of considerations that you have to think about here. I understand that there's a lot of permutations. I mean, you think about, okay, so we have our UPS in place. Batteries last for a certain period of time. They fail, so then we have the generator. Well, what happens if the generator fails? Does that mean that we need to have 2 big, huge generators on site? Then you have to think about the fuel supply for the generator. What happens if the company that is delivering the fuel to the generator goes out of business? Do we need to have a second fuel supply? I mean, that's the thing. It's dizzying if you think about all the different possibilities that things can fail. And because of that, it can be overwhelming. But that's why go ahead, work with the business, work with your team, go back to the basics. Look at what actually needs to be protected, and then you can come up with a better way. Software. All of you here are probably SQL Server DBAs, and so you're probably familiar with a lot of these different ideas. SQL Server has been providing these different options as far back to SQL 7, SQL 2000. All of these are useful tools. And again, we're talking about highly available data. These are all used to help keep your data available to your business. Backup and restore. You made it to my first webinar. We talked a lot about all the different backup and restore techniques you can use. Backup and restore is really kind of both an HA and a DR concept, because you can use limited level restores in order to keep the data provided to the customer, as well as using what I call stupid data tricks to make sure that you have the critical tables available for your customers and for your applications. But if everything goes down and you have to do a full restore and you're in a disaster situation, then it becomes a DR issue. Log shipping, been around forever, works really well. Really high level, the point of log shipping is that you have a continuous flow of transaction logs going to a standby database. This provides a recovery option. You could use it for both HA and or DR, depending on how you would script out the connections to that standby database. One of the neat things about log shipping is that it's kind of an unexpected feature, but you can set the interval when those logs are restored. So one little feature of log shipping you can do is if you purposely delay it, knowing by doing that you are not keeping that standby database current with your primary database. But what it also does is it gives you a buffer. So let's say that a mistake is made, some change is made to the application, and you have to do a recovery. Well, because that your standby database is 2 hours behind, guess what? You have a up and running copy of the production database that's 2 hours old that you can recover from. So that means that you could stop the users, you could go ahead and restore a copy, stop the copies from the log shipping, take copies or take the data that you need from that standby database, and you could restore it into production. So that way you didn't have to do a real outage. You didn't have to do a full restore. It means that you probably, ideally, hopefully, you could do a targeted restore, meaning that you don't have to do a full restore of the database, but instead you could just restore critical tables. Mirroring. Mirroring was deprecated in SQL Server 2016, I think. I could be wrong on that one, but the point is it still works just as well as before. Basic concept of mirroring. Mirroring was before always-on availability groups came out, but the idea of mirroring is that you have an instance, and depending on how you set it up, you will have either you'll have a synchronous or an asynchronous copy of that production instance. The difference between synchronous and asynchronous is that synchronous is that the copy, in synchronous, the copy is written to the standby, the mirrored copy, before it's written to storage, while in asynchronous, it's written to storage first, and then it's written to the secondary copy. In mirroring, if you use your witness environment, the witness instance, that will allow you to do that instant failover. So even when you fail over, you may have to do some scripting, but the point is that you can keep the application running just as well as it was before. If you're doing an asynchronous, you may be thinking more of a disaster recovery sort of environment. But the point is that the technology is very solid. I've had a lot of luck with it. And the other thing is to remember is that all of these work across the WAN, and some maybe a little bit better than the others. But so you could mirror, or you could log ship, but you could mirror to a remote site. So if you have your alternate data center, maybe in a different city, state, country, you can have that mirroring going, and so you know that in a true disaster situation where that your primary data center is gone, that you could bring up the business on that alternate data center. Same with always-on availability groups. That's an evolution. I mean, there's some pieces of all of these technologies in each one of them, but always-on availability groups is a big evolution of mirroring. The main thing to remember about always-on is that you have to have Windows failover clusters underneath. That's going to increase your licensing costs as well as your complexity. It works really well, but you have to be aware of that. Always on, you have the same sort of synchronous and asynchronous permutations. You have a fewer number of replicas available if you're doing synchronous than if you're doing asynchronous. But once again, you can go ahead and have your replicas all over the place in different data centers. The main thing is they just have to be able to connect. And finally, replication. I am fond of replication. I know that it can be annoying to configure, but the truth about replication is once you get it working right, it works, it just works. And it'll keep on going and going and going and going. And that's exactly what you want to need. Fundamentals of replication is that Microsoft had the old, the idea of a magazine model. And so you have your publisher, which is the database that's being replicated, and then you have subscribers. So you can have as many, I don't know if there's a limit, but you can have as many subscribers, I think, as you want. I'm sure that there's probably some sort of realistic limit, but I've certainly had 6, 8, 10 subscribers before. It works just fine. Those copies are being replicated using log shipping. Those transaction logs are being, the changes in the transaction logs are being dribbled over there. And that's one of the neat things about replication is that once you get the initial setup done, it's very low as far as bandwidth goes. I think one of the points is that all of these are more of an HA concept with some DR permutations, but they all have a secondary sort of concept, which means that you can also use it for the business during normal production. You're not in an HA situation. You're not in a disaster situation. In all of them except for mirroring, it gets a little bit trickier, but you can use those secondary databases for reading. So maybe you could use them for reporting, things like that. I've used a lot of replication for making sure that you have all the production data for reporting. Data tricks. Another thing about HA, so we talked about this at LinkedIn in my Backup and Restore webinar, but the point is that you could be constantly making sure that certain key tables are always available for the business. Now, the business isn't necessarily going to know what those tables are, but they're going to be able to tell you what the general concept is. For instance, perhaps maybe a currency table or currency exchange table, or maybe the vendor table or the sales table or the customer table, all these tables. And so you work with the business and the business says, well, as long as we had this data available to us, we could keep on going and we could still sell our product, or we could still talk to our customers and we could bring in money and keep the business going. So this is where you can really shine using T-SQL, using your automation, using PowerShell. The point is that it doesn't matter. You can just take these tables and you can schedule a automatic copy of these tables. I said, create table name as select star from table name. You just automate that sort of feature, and then you're guaranteed that that table is going to be available. And you don't have to do it in the local database. If you have, whether you use linked servers or some other concept, the point is that you could be redirecting that data output to other databases and other instances on your alternate data center, on another continent, into Azure. The thing is that you can keep that there. Another key thing to remember is database objects. I'm thinking about SSRS. One of the things about SSRS is that oftentimes you're going to need stored procedures and views in order to make the reports work. So maybe you want to make sure that you have an additional copy of all those key objects that are needed. Maybe you have some sort of a key developer table where they keep pretty much everything that makes all their custom applications work. Make sure you have an extra copy of that. And then finally, also security. We talked in the security one about scripting out your users and roles. Why not do that? Because even if you, in a restore situation, you've got your data going, you've got your hardware going, oops, you forgot to restore all the security. And without security, no one's going to be able to access it. But HA is there to keep the business running, but eventually mistakes are going to be made. Things are going to happen, and you might have a DR, disaster recovery scenario. Again, as I stressed before, it's not high availability, it's highly available. The point is that the data, the application, the needs of the business can be made highly available, but not always available. Even though it's called always on availability groups, things still happen. So when those things happen, take a deep breath, step back. Ideally, you've had your discussion. Even though it may seem that the whole way of the world, and trust me, I know I have been in that situation more times than I want to count, where something is down, and I am the person who's been designated to restore it. It's scary, it's overwhelming, it's stressful. Keep your calm, keep your cool. Look at your plans, think about what you need to do, and then work on it. As I stated before, the responsibility of restoring the data is yours, and the responsibility to have the discussion with the business is yours. The responsibility of making sure that all of the different applications of coverage is not necessarily yours. You have to make the business aware that there are possibilities, there are ideas, there are ways in order to keep these critical applications going. But the business has to work with you as a partner, and you all have to work together to make sure that there's a plan in place so that you can actually keep the business going as best as possible based on the budget. You are going to have to perform heroic actions. There's no question. Whether you're up all night waiting for a restore to finish, you're coordinating with people. Communication is always our #1 priority. But there's a limit to what you actually can keep running. The main thing is that, again, stepping back, is have the discussion with the business, document everything that was discussed, and then keep that plan in place. And make sure you do all that while you're keeping your day job going too. So no worries, lots of time. But let's get into the DR scenarios. You've gone past the point of high availability and you're doing a recovery. That is now a disaster. This is where that thin line between HA and DR is, because if you do it quick enough, is it actually become a disaster, or is it still you're just doing high availability stuff? I don't know, we could argue about that one all night, but the point is that eventually you're going to get to the point where you're going to have to do a recovery. And where does the DBA fit into it? Again, tough situation, keep your head, go back to your documentation, go back to your plan, know what you're going to do. Ideally, you've been practicing doing a few restores. Maybe you have it all scripted out. You have to also think about the time of your customers too. That's where some of the stress is coming in. Much like what's going on today in the current world, maybe people aren't being quite as productive, but yet businesses, they still want to be paid, and businesses don't want to necessarily do that. Same sort of thing in a disaster recovery situation, where those staff are unable to work, and worse is the fact is that all the work that they've put in up to this point may be wasted. So there's a lot of stress coming from all different directions. And you, the poor DBA, is going to be one of the people who's going to have to fix it. But you are uniquely situated because as a good DBA, you understand the underlying infrastructure as well as the business. So you're going to be one of those key people who's going to help identify what needs to be covered, where it needs to be recovered, and when it needs to be recovered. I think this is probably the 4th or 5th time. Take a breath. It's not necessarily all your fault. It's your fault when you didn't have the conversation with the business, much like during the HA conversation. But it's your responsibility to keep that conversation going. But you still have to, eventually you have to sit down and put pen to paper and make sure that you have a plan in place. Also, you happen to know the systems and you know the business, so you're going to have a pretty good idea about what needs to be taken care of. Another thing that maybe, again, that's where you get into the triaging, knowing what the critical systems are. It could be that you see another system is about ready to fall off the cliff without a parachute. And the stress is that I should fix that system, but it could be that maybe that system, while it seems important, is not critical to the business. So again, having the plan, knowing what's important. Disaster recovery with hardware. So all of these scenarios apply whether you're talking about locally on-prem, if you're talking about an alternate data center, or if you're talking about going into the cloud. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you will probably have secondary servers. Secondary servers, the purpose of it is that you're going to have a copy of your data on those secondary servers. Then the question whether you want to have them cold or hot. So a cold server is one that is kept powered down on purpose. And when a crisis happens, the server is powered up and you may have to do a restore of the database. So when you're having your conversation with the business about your RTO and RPO, you have to put that sort of factor into place. Obviously, it's a lot easier for the IT professional to have a hot server, but it may be that there's some requirements. It depends on just how things work. Maybe it was a space issue. Every business has their own expenses and bills, and you can't always accommodate every one of them. You can't have a perfect situation. So you have to take what you have and make it work. One idea you can do is that in order to keep that secondary server hot, is that you can let it be dual purpose. So most of the time that server is going to be your additional web server, and it's going to deal with the additional load in your business. But when a crisis truly happens, you've already got your production database restored onto it. You shut down the web services and you make that server do its job, the DR job. Just a different idea. So if you're using an alternate data center, let's say we're not locally anymore, same sort of conversation has to apply. What are you paying for? Now, I mean, the cold server thing, I understand, is pretty uncommon now, but it still could happen. But still a good question to have when you're talking to your data center. So when you're paying for secondary servers in the data center, are they going to provide a hot server? And then how are you as the DBA going to make sure that that data is kept up to date? What sort of system are you use? What technology are you use? Going back to the software, are you going to use your log shipping or your mirroring or your always on? The point is that you have to think about how are you going to provide the best service to the business with the software and hardware that you have. Storage discussion. That's another thing I mentioned briefly about the SAN and the NAS, depending on what your business is. I don't know about you, but if you were to had to restore a multi-terabyte or even heavens forbid a petabyte SAN, how long is that going to take? So if you have everything on this wonderful, very expensive SAN device in your data center, what are you doing about copying that thing? If you had to go to tape, how long would it take to bring those tapes online or bring those tapes back to the location? How long would it take to do the restore? Tape takes a while to mount. You have to restore the data. All of these things take time. And so you have to step back and think about all these different calculations when you're creating this plan about how long it's going to take. Another thing, when you're talking to that data center, if it's assuming it's not directly owned by your business, is what about their staffing? What are they doing? Do they have, you've already thought about the UPS, the battery backup and the generator for your local data center. Well, what is your alternate data center doing? Do they have situations if they were to lose power? How long could they provide service? And if they did lose power and they brought up on backups, is the network connection going to work? So maybe your users are up, your systems are up, your network capabilities there, but for some reason the alternate data center did not think about that and they don't have a good backup connection for you to get in there. There's something wrong there. Finally, legacy equipment. There are businesses that use older equipment and they may be stuck with it because of older applications, certain requirements put in by government regulations. The point is that you may have to keep a shelf full of old hard drives or old power supplies or something like that in order to restore that equipment if something were to fail. It's a realistic concern. You know, eBay's your friend, but the point is that look for that old equipment. So disaster situation, you've got your servers up, everything's running. Now it's time to be putting your recovery strategy back into play. We talked about RPO and RTO again. Again, how long is it going to take, first of all, to get those backups into a place where you as a DBA can actually start restoring the data? You've already analyzed the time it's going to take. You know that whether you're bringing tapes from offsite or if you're bringing backups from across the WAN, the point is it's going to take a certain period of time. And that's the point when you need to really start communicating. It's like, okay, 2 hours until we get the backups in our hands. 1 hour. We have the backups in our hands. Now we're going to start the restore. Oops, something happened. That backup didn't work. So we're going to have to go reset the clock again, and we're going to have to go back and get the next backup available. These are all things that you need to think about, that maybe you want to make sure that you have more than one backup available. Backup and recovery webinar, we talked about the idea of automating your production, automatically restoring your production backups into a test system. It's a really fine way to make sure that you're testing your backups every night. Why not do that? That way you know that you have good backups that are available. You have those test systems. Maybe you could use those as part of your strategy. You lost your production server. but you know that you have the backup from the night before that works just fine. These are all different options that you can think about. Be clever. Use all the different tools that are available for you. While you're thinking about this, mention about also, did you make sure that you backed up your security measures, your users, your roles? Again, if the users can't log in, they can't access the data. And another one that I've personally run into, I try not to do it, but sometimes space is an issue. So remember is that, let's say that your database is 200 gigabytes in size, and a compressed backup is going to be, maybe the compressed backup is only 60 gigabytes. Well, guess what? When it's restoring, you're going to need all that space. So you have to think about these things. So when you are planning this out, it would probably be a good idea to have 1.5 times the amount of space that you currently need to make sure that you have room for the backups. Lots of ways to get over this. You could have a shared drive that you could mount in times when you need to do a restore. There's options, but just one of those little gotchas that could really hurt when you're trying to do something at 2 in the morning. So you have all your fancy tools. We talked about log shipping, mirroring, always on, replication. All of these are usable options if you were getting into a disaster recovery situation. You just have to think about how you want to use them. Like log shipping, for instance, that database is in standby, but once you shut down the log shipping, then all of a sudden you can make that into your primary. Mirroring, you failed over, now what? Have you set up your scripting in order to point your applications to that? Always on. Again, with all of these, what happened if your primary data center, so your secondaries were all located in the same location? If it's truly a disaster situation, you can't access the primary data center. Make sure that you have your data in a different location. And yes, we're going to talk about Azure and the cloud. The idea is that that would be an awesome location for a secondary. And even little replication can be used as well too. But you have to have the capability to use that data. Also, data. We mentioned this before, also part of HA. But again, is it possible that the business could run based on some critical tables that you cleverly are already backing up in an alternate location? They mentioned also the objects, the rights, and the users. Make sure that you're backing up, find out what the critical stored procedures are for your different applications. In a disaster recovery situation, you may not be able to achieve perfect in the period of time that was given to you, but you may be able to accomplish something that gets the business up and running. That's the main thing. I mean, same thing, like it doesn't even matter if it's a data application or not like that. I mean, maybe it's a phone system. All of these things have to be taken into account. What does the business need in order to start moving forward and making money? Finally, people. I think this is one of those things that maybe is not always accounted for. We all take vacations. We take time off. Things happen. So when you're crafting your disaster recovery plan, you have to think about what are the people that you're going to need in order to make sure that everything can be brought up in time. It could be that you need those critical business analysts in order to test the applications once you restored them. Of course, you're going to need people from your IT team. Maybe this is an opportunity to work with HR. I mean, the point is that you need to identify the resources that you need. You need to document who they are, and you need to be aware of where they are. And if they're critical, then you need to have a phone list so that you can call them. That's why people are given, they used to be given pagers, and now they have cell phones. The point is that you should be able to get hold of the people that you need at that time in order to get the business running again. Team calendars, a really simple tool. Put something like that in Outlook or whatever, but the point is that when people are off, they're off. And you can look at that team calendar and quickly know when people are going to be available. Something for the business, think about that too. I mean, IT people are pretty used to being on call. They're pretty used to having pagers or cell phones in order to be contacted. Maybe the business isn't quite so used to that. So it's just one of those discussions that they know that they're in this situation, that they would reach out and get a hold of these people. One of the things I want to mention is that I mentioned in the chat beforehand, Randolph West he just put a great blog post out about keeping a copy of your personal tools in your work environment in the cloud, and there's a link right there. So what happens if the office is no longer available? This is very applicable to what we're dealing with right now. So perhaps it's some sort of a, for instance, I live in the state of Washington. We have a lot of rivers. What happened if something happened and maybe the river were to flood or a bridge were to go out, or there was just some sort of an issue where you couldn't get there and you don't have your laptop with you, right? And swimming is not going to work very well because it's going to take too long for your RTO. So the point is that if you have internet connection though, maybe you could go to some sort of a coffee bar or some other places and you could rent a PC, do something where you could log into your cloud environment. You could bring up this workstation that you've been carefully keeping up to date with all the tools that you need, all the context you need, all the passwords you need, and you can get right to work. Imagine if you were on a cruise ship, or you were finally going on that vacation to Paris that you've been wanting to go to a long time. Once again, maybe you didn't take your laptop along because you didn't want to deal with it in customs or getting through security. And so, but yet you find someone who has an internet connection and you can get online and you can start helping the situation. It's a bummer that you ruin your vacation, but it's great if you can help bring the business back online. Something from Microsoft. I was looking at one of the things that they released at the end of October was they changed the licensing benefits for people with software assurance. I know software assurance is expensive. Not everyone can afford to have it, but it is pretty neat what they did there. So before, you could only have one extra instance for HA that you weren't charged a license cost for. But now you can have, you get an additional one. You can have the included HA instance, plus you can have 2 standby instances free of charge. So the only cost there is the server cost, not the licensing. And apparently all supported versions are covered under this. So this may go back as far as like 2008 R2, because one of the things that Microsoft did in order to encourage people to migrate to the cloud, that if you migrate your 2008 R2 environment from on-prem to Azure, you get an additional 3 years worth of coverage, licensing coverage, or I'm sorry, support coverage for your version, keeping it going. But talking about synchronous and asynchronous. So the specific words of the licensing, and yes, I'm looking at my notes here, just want to make sure, is that you can have up to your one include HA instance, which is going to be your synchronous, and then you have your asynchronous, your standby. And one of the other things is that you can have one of those asynchronous environments in Azure. As we talked about before with mirroring and always on, as it synchronous means that you're writing to the secondary, whatever that may be, the replica, before it's written to storage. So they're kept in sync. If you have an asynchronous environment, that means that it's writing to storage first, and then it's going to write to the replicas, whatever they may be. Obviously, in a perfect world, you always want to have everything replicating instantly. You want to have that synchronous connection, but you're also talking about more bandwidth and more I/O, which is what's going to kill a database every single time. So maybe an option you might want to do is to have that asynchronous connection and save, improve the performance on your production server. The truth is probably most of the time it's not going to matter. It's going to be just fine. And we're not talking about a huge amount of time here. We're maybe talking about, I mean, I'm sure that you could shrink that gap down to probably less than even down to a minute. And most businesses can probably afford to lose a minute's worth of transactions. I understand. So the pictures right here from Microsoft is they're showing the old licensing rules, and you can see here where before that they charged you for that secondary, but now they're giving you for free. So that's fantastic. And again, if you had a situation where you had, here's your free, right here where my mouse is going, over on the left-hand slide, you have server 1, server 2, server 3 on-prem. So you got the free licensing for that passive secondary for HA, but you were charged for that passive secondary for DR. But now they're not going to charge you for the, they're not going to charge you licensing for either one of these copies. So that's a great advantage. But what if you can't afford a SA? Lots of companies are in that situation. So what you need to do is you just need to look at your hardware needs and your licensing costs. So one of the things to remember is that Microsoft does their licensing, the way they push is going to be on the core price. So look at your hardware. How many cores do you have on that server? Whether you're doing enterprise or standard, you have cores, and you're going to be charged on the licenses for those servers. But people sometimes forget is that there's also, they still honor the server plus CAL model. Server licenses are incredibly cheap, but server licenses don't have any CALs associated, meaning no users can log on. But it could be that for your secondary server, you go ahead and pay for that server license, which I guarantee you is probably about like 2% of the cost of paying for a core license. And then maybe you have a couple CALs. So the idea is that you keep 1 or 2 CALs for normal maintenance procedures on that secondary server to keep it hot. So you're ready for SA, or you're ready for HA. And then maybe you have part of the plan in place that you know that maybe you're going to buy some more CALs, or heavens forbid, but maybe you do what you need to do in order to get the business working, and then you ask for forgiveness later. Usually Microsoft, as long as you're working with them, you say, look, we had this situation, this is what we had to do, but we were using these extra licenses during this period of time. They're probably going to say that's fine because we want you to be a happy customer. They're not going to give you a lot of issues about that. So once again, if you really look at your environment, it could be that you could save, so you could come up with some fairly cost-effective measures in order to maintain multiple servers and have that HA, have that DR plan in place. And also think about how much is your time worth. As a DBA, maybe, even though I just said that you could look deeper into your environment, you could save expenses, but put that concept forth to the business and say, well, we could do this, we couldn't do this, this is how much it's going to cost. And the business may come back and say, well, you know what, actually I think it's great, maybe we should do it SA because it's going to just save us a whole lot of time, even though it's not going to save us necessarily money, and it's going to make things easier. So finally, let's talk about Azure a little bit. Azure is a pretty neat thing. Again, remember, Azure is no different. It is different. It's not different from your off-prem data centers. It's just an evolution of the concept. But advantages, first of all, your data center is already located off-site. Due to the very nature of Azure, we all know that these data centers are hidden around, but they are on the planet. They are terrestrial. Second, Microsoft is covering you by making sure that even the cheapest, smallest options already have multiple forms of redundancy in place. And finally, depending upon your business needs, your DR instances can be easily shut down and back up again, saving on cost. Remember, we talked about hot and cold. So one of the oldest tricks with your Azure environment is if you're not using the server, shut it down. So why couldn't you do that with your DR instances? All they're going to charge you for is they're going to charge you for the storage costs. They're not going to charge you for the compute time. So that's something that you might want to think about, where that you can have a cost-effective Azure DR instance, not HA, but at least DR. Disadvantages of Azure, and this again applies to an offsite data center. Your network was already your biggest bottleneck. Now it's your only lifeline. That was already an issue, but you have to think about that again. Microsoft does do a really good job, but they do have outages, and you have to understand how to take advantage of all the options. The options get a little bit dizzying. We're going to talk about them for a little bit. Another thing is that there's layers of obfuscation because of depending on what you're paying for. If you want to have very quick SLAs with Azure, then you have to pay for the higher level support. It's going to cost you money, but that's what you're going to have to pay in order to have quick access to support personnel in order to get things running. It may be that doing a little bit more local, meaning like that maybe you work with a data center that's local to your business, you probably will get a faster response because worst case scenario, maybe you could drive over there if the bridges burn out, something like that. Again, this all gets back down to the planning, the talking to the business, understanding what the needs are. Once you explain these are the limitations, the business is going to love to work with you and make sure that things are better. And then offsite options, I mean, these, as I pointed out before, this is issues with any sort of offsite data center. If you can't walk across the parking lot and go to your data center and fix the server, well, then it's offsite. And so you have to keep that consideration in mind. Again, all of your things are connected via network. Think about the redundancy in your network. Don't want to make the mistake where you spend lots of money on having that great HADR plan and then you only have one network option. So we'll talk briefly about some of the features of Azure, why these things are just built in. And this also, again, if you're spending more money, but the point is that every Azure data center is set up with fault domains and update domains. So the fault domain represents an actual server rack. And of course, it has redundant network connections. It has dual power supplies, just like in an on-prem data center. And then you also have the update domains. So the idea there is that if you are within an availability set, which is one step above just buying a single VM in an Azure data center, is that Microsoft is going to make sure that your VM is going to be replicated across different update domains, meaning that when they have to do necessary patching and maintenance because they keep everything up to date, that you're not going to be affected. Again, that's only if you're paying for an availability set. So remember, availability sets refer to the local Azure data center. But then as we scope out a little bit, we have availability zones. So availability zones are covering, these are different data centers within an Azure region. So it depends, like for instance, I have access to the, we all have access to all the different regions, but for instance, I normally use the region of West US 2. So the point is that within that availability zone, you would go ahead and there would be different data centers that make up that region. And so Microsoft is going to replicate your server, your different VMs across multiple availability sets within different availability zones. And then finally, let's say that you were concerned about something happened to your actual region. Something happens to the whole West Coast or something like that. You can have region pairs, which means that you can have your data available in different regions. Obviously, each one of these options are going to cost more, but it's something to consider depending upon how critical your data is. It's all a little bit complicated, and you know it's going to be expensive. But whether you have a local on-site option or you're working with another vendor to provide off-site support, you have to keep the business running. And that really gets down to what we're talking about. This is your job. So remember these basics: hardware, software, data, and people. So here's a checklist. Working with a business. When you have these discussions with the business, you need to talk about each system. Every system. Your responsibility is to make sure that you dig deep and you make sure that all the systems are representative. Talking about the criticality level, the RTO and the RPO for each system. What are all the components needed for each application? So different applications have different parts. Maybe they have some sort of meta layer that exists in a different database. Maybe they have a web front end. Maybe they don't have a web front end. Maybe they have a user application that's on the desktop. There's lots of different pieces that can make up what the business considers a system. And so you have to make sure that all of those components are listed out, and then you go through each one. I understand this sounds like a lot of work. It is. But if you want to have an effective HA and DR plan for your company, you need to know what all the different pieces are. Talk about triaging. Can you maybe limp along, like maybe you don't need the web front end because the users can have the local application installed on their PC. They don't like it, but it will allow them to get the job done. So think about these different options. And so you could have different plans saying that, at this time point, we need to have this component ready. At this time point, we can then have this component ready. Finally, who are the staff members that you need from the business in order to make sure all this can happen? You yourself are not going to be able to do it by yourself. IT themselves are not going to be able to do it all. You need to have the business working with you, providing the necessary staff in order to verify that what has been restored is adequate to make the business run. Finally, is it documented? Working with the infrastructure team, depending on how big your business is. They're the ones who are going to make sure that each system has the redundancy and the storage redundancy that is needed in order to make sure those servers are up. They're also probably going to be the poor souls who are responsible to make sure that those legacy systems are running. Or they're going to be the ones making sure that those hard-to-find components are available. They're on a shelf somewhere, but they know that they could just go and pop them back into place. Networking. If one thing has been made clear here is that, especially with your DR solutions where you're doing either an offsite data center or you're using Azure, the point is that you have to have a network connection in order to access it. How are you going to do that? What is your plan? What is the redundancy for that networking? And then finally, what are the staff members that are needed during a crisis? How do they access them? Have that team list, have that phone list. And finally, once again, is it documented? Working with the data team, that would be you and maybe other people who would use the applications. You're the people who understand better than what is needed in order to make sure an application is running. You have to think about what measures are being used for HANDR. Meaning is what is your chosen tool or tools? Because remember, on these different things, for instance, you can do replication off of a always-on availability group database. You can do different things, but that might cause problems. So let's say that if you're replicating the data at the same time, maybe you can't fail over. So you have to think about all these different pieces. Is it documented? And maybe more importantly, is it automated? Because you want ideally to have this go as seamlessly and smoothly as possible. So have it there, test it out. That's what you just need to do. Also, who are the staff members needed during a crisis? If you're an army of one, that's a problem. What if you weren't there? What if you were finally taking that vacation time? Work with your management, work with the business, make sure that you have extra people who are available who could be, pardon the term, spun up in the need of a crisis. We mentioned briefly that blog post about having the workstation available. Also, make sure that you have maybe paper copies of the accounts, the phone numbers, the passwords. Maybe you don't have a network connection, but you need to have a list so you can get to those people. Finally, communicate. When you're doing this, you've got to get everyone involved. You've done your due diligence, you've talked to the business, you are aware of the various systems that are needed for the business to function, you know what the criticality is, and so then you can go to your management and executive team and say, this is what we need to do, this is what the business has said, this is what we need to do in order to maintain business continuity. Okay, you've done your job at that point. You have made sure that they are clear. There's nothing missing, you hope. You've done a good job presenting all the information. Then they are able to do their job, which is to make the decisions about what's important, work with you, come up with a good solution in order to maintain your highly available data, as well as your disaster recovery problem. Once you get to that point, then you can document it. And then finally, you send it back to the business and have a review. Yes, I understand this is a long process. And then finally, you update it. One of our poll questions was people, I applaud the people who said that 58% of the people on this call, this webinar, said that they had updated their DR plan this year. That's fantastic. Because unfortunately, sometimes once you get these DR plans in place, then they just get put in a cabinet and everyone forgets about them. So in case it wasn't clear, don't work in a vacuum. Cover yourself, cover the business. That's the whole point. A couple random points. I just thought we were talking, again, we've been talking about Azure. We've been talking mostly about VMs. But SQL Azure, the original Azure instance that was offered by Microsoft, can be used for your log shipping, mirroring, replication needs. It's one of those, it's a low-cost way, and you can provide HA features. And something that I thought was kind of cool, I read a paper, it was talking about how the Azure SQL platform takes responsibility. You can see it right here. Takes responsible for maintaining high availability by tightly integrating with Azure Service Fabric. It allows persistence of data and log fails using n-way replication on local SSD disks. So even though SQL Azure is a lower cost option, it doesn't mean that Microsoft is not taking it just as seriously as everything else. So you can feel comfortable by using that as an HA sort of, if you want to use it for HA capabilities. What did we cover? Pricing for all the different options. It's impossible to know how your business works, what you're going to need, what are your situations. And we also didn't cover how to configure all these different options. There are tons of great information out there on how to configure your log shipping, your mirroring, your replication, your always on availability groups. Go out there and look, see what other people have done or figure out yourself. Random chaos, testing disaster before disaster, always a good idea. I don't know if there's a good way to document this, but essentially create a disaster. Have someone go into the data center and unplug something, power something off, kick something, do something in order to create a disaster. Most companies don't have the luxury to do this, but if you do, then you're going to have an idea of what's going to happen, and you'll be able to respond appropriately to it and have a better idea, so it won't be as scary. What did we cover? We covered differences between HA and DR as a concept, all the different HA features in current server hardware, HA and DR features and SQL Server offerings, the pros and cons of using Azure and any other data center vendor, and some of the cool features that are available in Azure to promote business continuity. Again, plan, talk, collaborate, document, review, and present. Do those in any order you want to, but the point is work with the business, get all this stuff on paper. So anyway, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on this presentation, and let's see what sort of questions we might have, if we have anything. And it looks like, oh, here we go. It's like the people who asked the question is always on, Sushma asks, is always on availability groups feature present in SQL Server Standard version. It is actually an unlimited version. I believe that you can have one replica. So that's one option. That's all I see. Crystal, you see any other questions?
I don't see any more.
No? Okay.
Yep, that's the last one. Always available groups. Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for hosting. We appreciate it as always. This is our 4th season. We have one more episode left in our series, in our DBA Madness series. So you guys, please stay tuned for that next week. If you guys have any questions or think of anything that you guys missed in this webinar, please feel free to reach out to Michael or myself. As always, this is recorded, and you guys will receive the recording tomorrow in your email box around noon, so stay tuned for that as well. And like I said, if you guys are interested in our DBA services or any of our remote services, please feel free to click the link that is in the chat. And thank you guys so much for attending. I hope you guys stay safe. Have a good rest of your week, and thank you. See you guys in the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.